You know, I've lived through enough monetary crises to tell you something about currencies. I saw the breakdown of Bretton Woods in 1971. I watched Paul Volcker fight inflation in the early 80s by raising interest rates to levels that would make your head spin. I've seen currencies collapse, central banks panic, and entire monetary systems get restructured. And let me tell you something that is happening right now, something most people aren't paying attention to. China is building an alternative to the dollar-based financial system. Not through military force, not through diplomatic pressure, through technology, through a digital currency, through something they call the e-CNY, the digital yuan. And if you think this does matter, if you think this is just some technical innovation that won't affect you, you are not thinking clearly. You are not understanding what is at stake. I think that one should recognize reality even when one doesn't like it. Indeed, especially when one doesn't like it. And the reality is this. China has created a digital currency that is being used right now today for cross-border trade settlements. 15% of China's trade, 15%, was settled in e-CNY by the third quarter of 2025. That is not a pilot program. That is not a test. That is real money moving through a real system. Let me explain what they've done. The People's Bank of China has built something called the m-CBDC Bridge Project. This is a multilateral initiative involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates. And by September 2025, this system had facilitated $2 trillion in cross-border transactions, $2 trillion, through a system that completely bypasses SWIFT, through a system that processes transactions in under 10 seconds, through a system that doesn't use dollars at all. Now, you might be thinking, what is SWIFT? Let me tell you. SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It is the messaging system that banks use to transfer money internationally, and it is dominated by Western institutions. It is how America enforces sanctions. It is how America maintains financial surveillance over the global economy, and China just built an alternative to it. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of something I learned decades ago about how systems change. They don't change all at once, they change gradually. Then suddenly, I remember when I was a young lawyer, people thought the gold standard would last forever. Then Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, and suddenly the whole system was different. Currencies were floating, exchange rates were volatile, everything changed, but it didn't happen overnight. There were years of pressure building up, years of other countries getting frustrated with American monetary policy, years of de Gaulle demanding gold for his dollars. And then, one Sunday night in August, Nixon announced that we weren't converting dollars to gold anymore. And that was that. The system that had existed since Bretton Woods in 1944 was over. This digital yuan situation feels similar. There is pressure building up. There are countries getting frustrated with dollar dominance. There are nations that want alternatives. And China is giving them one. By March 2025, the People's Bank of China had fully integrated its e-CNY cross-border settlement system with 10 ASEAN nations and 6 Middle Eastern countries. 10 ASEAN nations, 6 Middle Eastern countries. These aren't small players. These are countries that do massive amounts of trade. Massive amounts. And they are increasingly settling that trade in digital yuan, not dollars. Yuan now. Let me tell you why this matters. The dollar's dominance in global finance is based on America's trade volume. The U.S. accounts for only 11% of global trade, but the dollar is used in 88% of foreign exchange trades. Why? Because of network effects. Because everyone uses dollars, everyone else has to use dollars. Because commodities are priced in dollars. Because trade is invoiced in dollars. Because central banks hold dollars as reserves. It is like Microsoft Windows in the 90s. Everyone uses it because everyone else uses it, even if there are better alternatives. But network effects can flip. It happened with MySpace and Facebook. It happened with Blockbuster and Netflix. Once enough people switch to the new system, the old system collapses. And that is what China is betting on. They not trying to replace the dollar overnight. They rebuilding parallel infrastructure, alternative payment rails systems that work alongside the dollar system. Until they don't need the dollar system anymore. You know what the smart thing about their approach is? They not asking for permission. They not trying to reform the IMF or get more voting rights at the World Bank. They just building their own system, and they remaking it convenient. The digital yuan has no transaction fees. Zero. Most payment systems charge 40 to 60 basis points on transactions. The e-CNY charges nothing, and it settles instantly. No intermediaries, no delays, no correspondent banks taking their cut. For businesses doing trade with China, this is incredibly attractive. Why pay fees and wait days for settlement when you can settle instantly for free? Let me tell you a story. Trip.com, a major Chinese travel company, their head of treasury said, "It is great because there are no transaction fees. Unlike current digital wallets in China's payments landscape, yet it is just as instantaneous. It offers 24/7 settlement even on national holidays. 24/7 settlement, no holidays, no weekends, no waiting for banks to open. That is a huge advantage. And China is stopping there. In June 2025, they established an international operations center in Shanghai. This hub includes platforms for blockchain-based standardized transactions and digital asset management. They rebuilding out the full infrastructure, not just payments, trade finance, letters of credit, all of it, all digital, all yuan denominated. By the fourth quarter of 2025, 30% of China's $6.2 trillion in global trade in goods was being settled in digital yuan. 30%. And RMB-denominated interest rate derivatives saw an 81.9% surge in daily turnover to $63.2 billion. These are big numbers, real money, real markets developing. Now, you might ask, can the digital yuan really challenge the dollar? Let me tell you what the skeptics say. They say China would need to liberalize its capital account, remove capital controls, make the yuan fully convertible, increase transparency in its economic data, and they rewrite those things would be necessary for the yuan to become a global reserve currency like the dollar. But here is what the skeptics are missing. China doesn't need the yuan to be a reserve currency. Not right away. They just need it to be a transaction currency, a currency for settling trade. And that is already happening. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Massive infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, the Middle East. And increasingly, these projects mandate yuan-based settlements. If you want Chinese financing for your port or your railway or your power plant, you settle in yuan. That is the deal. And more countries are taking that deal because they need the infrastructure. Because China is offering terms that Western institutions want match. I don't think anyone should underestimate China's determination to internationalize the renminbi. They've been working on this for decades slowly. Patiently, it is waiting that helps you as an investor, and a lot of people just can stand to wait. Well, China can wait. They think in decades, not quarters, and they remaking progress. According to SWIFT data from June 2025, the renminbi accounted for approximately 3.6% of global payments by value. It ranks fifth globally. That doesn't sound like much, 3.6%. But 10 years ago, it was basically zero. 20 years ago, it was literally zero. Now, let me tell you what worries me about all this, not from an investment perspective necessarily, but from a geopolitical perspective. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency gives America enormous advantages. It allows the U.S. to finance government debts at low interest rates. It allows America to run persistent trade deficits without triggering inflation. It gives the U.S. leverage to enforce sanctions and combat money laundering. If that status erodes, if the dollar becomes just one currency among many, America's room for maneuver shrinks dramatically. And there is a security dimension too. I don't want to stop having free trade with a big nuclear power like China. China and the United States have to get along each country would be out of its mind not to get along with the other. I think trade helps us to get along. But if we re-in competing currency blocks, if we re-in a new Cold War with economic weapons, that is dangerous. Very dangerous. I lived through the actual Cold War. I remember what that was like. The paranoia, the brinkmanship, the constant threat of things spiraling out of control. We don't want to go back to that, but I also think we need to be realistic about what is happening. The digital yuan is real. As of June 2025, it had processed over $7.3 trillion in cumulative transactions. It operates in more than 29 cities in China. People use it for everything from public transit fares to salaries to retail purchases. This isn't vaporware. This isn't a pilot program that might work someday. This is a functioning system processing trillions of dollars, and it is expanding internationally. The PBOC, the People's Bank of China, has pledged to expand the international use of the digital yuan and called for the development of a multipolar global currency system. Multipolar, that is the key word, not yuan dominance. Multipolar, China is trying to replace dollar hegemony with yuan hegemony. They're trying to create a system where multiple currencies are used, where countries have choices, where America can unilaterally impose financial sanctions. And you know what? A lot of countries want that. They're tired of being subject to American monetary policy, tired of dollar volatility affecting their economies, tired of the threat of being cut off from SWIFT if they do something Washington doesn't like. The digital yuan offers them an alternative, an escape valve. So what should America do about this? That is the big question. Some people say we should rush to create our own CBDC, our own central bank digital currency. I am not so sure about that. Darrell Duffy from Stanford says Washington shouldn't rush its response. And I think he is probably right. The real threat to the dollar's preeminence would come from internal U.S. policies that undermine global confidence in America's financial stability and commitment to open markets. That is the key insight. Self-defeating policies. If America maintains sound fiscal policy, if we keep inflation under control, if we remain committed to free markets and the rule of law, the dollar will remain dominant. Even with Chinese competition. But if we don't do those things, if we print money recklessly, if we weaponize the dollar too aggressively, if we undermine confidence in American institutions, then the dollar's status will erode. Digital yuan or not, you do get an occasional opportunity to see how the world is changing. And right now we're rewatching a fundamental shift in the global financial system. It is happening slowly. Most people aren't noticing. But it is happening. By the time most people wake up to what has occurred, it'll be too late to do much about it. That is how these things work, gradually. Then suddenly, I remember in the 70s, most Americans still thought of the dollar as being as good as gold, even though Nixon had closed the gold window in 1971. Even though we devalued twice, people still had this mental model of the dollar being backed by gold. It took years for that psychology to change, for people to realize we were in a new system, a system of floating exchange rates and fiat currencies. And during that transition period, there was enormous volatility, enormous uncertainty. People lost a lot of money betting that the old system would continue. I suspect we're in a similar transition period now. The dollar-dominated system that has existed since Bretton Woods, that has lasted for 80 years, is gradually being supplemented by alternatives. Maybe those alternatives replace the dollar. Maybe the dollar will remain first among equals, but it be the only game in town. It be as dominant. And that has profound implications for American fiscal policy, for interest rates, for inflation, for standards of living. If America can finance its deficits as easily, if foreign central banks are holding fewer dollars, if trade is increasingly settled in other currencies, then the U.S. government will face harder budget constraints. That is not necessarily a bad thing. It might force more fiscal discipline, but it'll be a change, a significant change. And changes of this magnitude, changes in the global monetary system, they don't happen smoothly. They happen with a lot of turbulence. IV lived through enough to know that. The breakdown of Bretton Woods wasn't smooth. The Latin American debt crisis in the 80s wasn't smooth. The Asian financial crisis in the 90s wasn't smooth. These transitions are messy. People get hurt, countries default. Banks fail. So what should you do about all this? If you are an investor, if you are someone trying to protect your wealth through this transition, conservative investing and steady saving without expecting miracles is the way to go. Some people can figure out how to take advantage of currency volatility, how to position for a multipolar currency system. I can teach everyone else to do it. It is pretty difficult. But the basics still apply. Own good businesses. Businesses with pricing power, businesses that can function regardless of which currency the world uses. Coca-Cola will sell Coke whether it is priced in dollars or yuan or euros. C.S. Candy will sell chocolates. Berkshire's insurance companies will write policies. The fundamental value of those businesses doesn't depend on the dollar remaining the global reserve currency. And you know what else? Some businesses might actually benefit from a multipolar currency system. Companies that facilitate international trade payment processors, currency exchange services. There will be opportunities, as there always are in times of change, but you have to be patient. You have to wait for the right opportunities. You can panic. You can try to predict exactly how and when things will shift. I've never been able to predict accurately. I don't make money predicting accurately. We just tend to get into good businesses and stay there. That is still the right approach, even in a changing monetary landscape. Maybe especially in a changing monetary landscape, because at the end of the day, what matters is which currency you are using. What matters is the real productive capacity of the economy, the goods and services being produced, the value being created. Currencies are just the medium of exchange. They not the actual wealth. The wealth is the businesses, the real estate, the productive assets, and those things will continue to have value regardless of whether we in a dollar-dominated system or a multipolar system. So pay attention to what is happening, understand the implications. But don't panic. Don't make dramatic moves based on predictions about currency markets. Just keep doing what works. Own good businesses. Save consistently. Live below your means. Be patient. And above all, recognize reality even when you don't like it. The world is changing. The financial system is evolving. China is building alternatives to dollar-dominated infrastructure. That is just the reality. We can wish it wasn't happening. We can hope American policymakers will respond intelligently, but we can ignore it. The digital yuan processed $7 trillion by mid-2025. 15% of China's trade is settled in e-CNY. $2 trillion has moved through the m-CBDC bridge. These aren't projections. These aren't possibilities. These are facts, things that have already happened, and they're going to keep happening. The trend is clear. China is building a parallel financial system. Other countries are joining. The dollar's dominance is being challenged, not tomorrow, not next year, but over the next decade or two, we're going to see significant changes in how international finance works. And if you are smart, you prepare for that. Not by making wild bets, but by positioning yourself to weather the transition, by owning assets that will retain value regardless of currency regimes. That is what I've always tried to do, and it has worked out pretty well. The great lesson I've learned over a long life is that you can stop change. You can wish the world would stay the same. All you can do is adapt, recognize what is happening. Position yourself intelligently, and be patient. If people weren't wrong so often, we wouldn't be so rich. And right now, a lot of people are wrong about the digital yuan. They dismissing it. They reassuming the dollar. Us dominance is permanent. It is not. Nothing in finance is permanent. Systems change. Power shifts. New technologies enable new structures. And this digital yuan, This is one of those enabling technologies. It is real, it is growing, and it is going to matter. The only question is how much